In 1978, the average Chinese person earned less than someone in war-torn Somalia. Today, China can build more infrastructure in a single year than most countries can manage in a decade. And if you've ever wondered how that kind of transformation even happens, how a country jumps from mass hunger to megacities in a single lifetime, this is the part of the story most people skip. Everyone reduces China's rise to cheap labor and factories. But the real story is darker, more deliberate, and honestly kind of unbelievable. The fastest mass escape from poverty in human history, with roughly 800 million people lifted out of extreme poverty in about 40 years. That, like taking the entire population of Europe from dirt poor to middle class in less than 2 generations. And it began with one man who got kicked out of power, twice survived political chaos, watched his family get shattered, then returned at an age when most leaders are stepping aside, only to rewrite the operating system of a civilization. Picture China in 1978. Not a little poor. We'd read talking about a country where people were literally starving to death by the millions just years earlier. Average income sat around $156 a year, not per month, per year. Under Mao, China tried the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, a campaign meant to turn the nation into an industrial powerhouse overnight. Instead, it became one of the worst man-made disasters in history. Estimates vary, but scholars widely describe tens of millions dead, mostly from starvation. Farmers were forced to make steel in backyard furnaces instead of growing food. Grain targets were faked. Reality was punished. And when the system collapsed, it didn't just fail economically, it failed biologically. People died. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was economically wrecked. The country produced less steel than Belgium. Belgium, a nation you could drive across in a couple hours. China held roughly a quarter of the world's population, but produced only a sliver of global GDP. The countryside looked stuck in a different century. Little electricity in most villages, no running water. Farmers using tools their great-grandparents would recognize. Cities weren't much better. People wore the same blue and gray Mao suits because that's what existed. No private businesses, no foreign investment, no freedom to choose your job. Jobs were assigned. Lives were allocated like ration cards. This is where our main character enters, Deng Xiaoping. Deng was short, barely 5 feet tall, but he had survived what would break most people. He'd been purged from the Communist Party twice during Mao's Cultural Revolution. His son was thrown from a window by Red Guards and paralyzed for life. Deng himself was sent away to work in a tractor factory, humiliation as policy. But he came back. When Deng effectively took power in 1978, he was 74 years old. Most people at 74 are thinking about retirement. Deng was thinking about how to save nearly 1 billion people from poverty, without detonating the political system that controlled them. And he had a plan that went against everything Communist China claimed it stood for. He delivered a line that became one of the most important quotes in modern economic history. "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." In other words, he didn't care if an idea was capitalist or communist. If it worked, China would do it. That was revolutionary in a country where private profit was treated like moral pollution. But Deng also understood the danger. He couldn't just flip a switch and turn China capitalist. That would trigger panic, especially among the old guard party elites who still held power and still feared losing control. So he engineered a compromise so clever it almost looks obvious in hindsight. He created special economic zones, SEEZs. Think of them as capitalism test labs inside a communist state. In 1980, China designated 4 cities as SEZs, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen. These places got different rules. Foreign companies could invest. Private businesses could operate. People could own property. Markets were allowed to breathe, but only in these contained spaces, like fire in a controlled burn. If it spread safely, they'd expand it. If it got out of hand, they could smother it. Now let's talk about Shenzhen, because this part sounds like fiction. In 1979, Shenzhen was a fishing village of around 30,000 people. Dirt roads, no buildings over a few stories, almost nothing. Today, Shenzhen is a metropolis of more than 12 million, a tech capital that pumps out smartphones, drones, and electronics at a scale most countries can't comprehend. In about 40 years, it went from rice paddies to a skyline that looks like a science fiction set. The SEZ experiment worked so well that China opened more and more. By the 1990s, entire coastal regions were operating under special rules. But Deng didn't just copy Western capitalism. He built something new. The government still controlled land and major industries, but private companies could operate, hire, fire, and keep profits. Foreign companies could build factories, but often had to partner with Chinese firms. It was capitalism with Chinese characteristics, market energy inside a political cage. And here says the detail that makes the whole machine run. Before China could become the world anti-Tao and factory, it had to fix its farms. The first spark of reform didn't come from a grand speech in Beijing. It came from desperation in a village. In Anhui province in 1978, 18 farmers held a secret meeting. They signed a contract to divide communal farmland among themselves. Each family would farm its own plot and keep what it grew. This was illegal. If caught, they could be executed. But they were hungry, and hunger makes people brave. The result was explosive. Their harvest that year was bigger than the previous 5 years combined. Word spread, other villages copied it. The practice became so widespread that Deng had no choice but to legalize it. By 1984, China dismantled the commune system that had governed rural life for decades. This was huge. When farmers could keep what they grew more. Much more. Agricultural output surged, and it did two things that changed history. First, people stopped starving. Second, it freed up millions of rural workers to leave farms and work in factories. In the space of just a few years, China created a surplus of food and a surplus of labor. Exactly the fuel an industrial takeoff requires. And outside China, the timing was almost perfect. In the 1980s and 1990s, Western companies were hunting for cheaper manufacturing bases. Japan had become more expensive. South Korea was rising, but still costly. Then executives looked at China and saw a once-in-a-century opportunity. Hundreds of millions of workers willing to work for low wages, a government that could build ports, roads, and power plants at command speed, and SEZs where foreign firms faced fewer restrictions and lower taxes. Money poured in. Nike, Dell, Sony. Later, the Apple-era supply chain. Companies built factories or contracted with Chinese manufacturers, and for a while the world told itself a comforting story. China will only be the workshop, the low-end assembler, the place that bolts together the real innovation created elsewhere. But that's not what happened. Chinese companies watched, learned, and started doing it themselves. At first, it was cheap knockoffs, fast, low quality, unbranded. Then it became competent, then competitive. And behind them stood a state that wasn't neutral. The government identified key industries it wanted to dominate: electronics, telecommunications, high-speed rail, solar panels. And then it did everything possible to help Chinese firms win. subsidies, cheap loans, domestic market protection, and technology acquisition through partnerships. Some call that cheating. Others call it industrial policy with no illusions. Either way, the early blueprint was set. Controlled capitalism inside controlled borders, production learning at national scale, and a political system determined to turn economic survival into strategic power. And once that blueprint was set, the acceleration didn't slow down. It compounded. Because China wasn't just becoming a place where things were assembled, it was becoming a place where the entire act of making things, design, parts, logistics, labor, power, ports, policy, was fused into one ruthless machine. By the early 2000s, China wasn't just pumping out cheap toys, it was making computers, smartphones, cars, and high-tech equipment. The phrase "made in China" didn't just mean bargain bin anymore. It started to mean everything. Today, China produces around 28% of the world's manufactured goods. It produces more steel than the rest of the world combined, more cement, more solar panels, more electric vehicles. And here's the part that shocks people. This is no longer mainly about low wages. Chinese wages rose dramatically over time, yet companies kept building there, kept sourcing there, kept tying their supply chains to China like a knot that gets tighter every year. Why? Because China built something no other country has at that scale: a complete industrial ecosystem. Imagine you want to make a new smartphone. In China, you can find a screen supplier within minutes, a battery maker nearby, camera modules, casings, packaging, tooling, assembly lines, testing labs, all clustered, all connected by highways and fast ports, all able to pivot quickly if a design changes. If something breaks, you can send someone to the factory and have a fix within hours. Now try doing that if your screen supplier is in Japan, your battery maker is in Korea, your assembly is in Vietnam, and your logistics are routed through 3 different port systems with 3 different regulatory environments. It's a nightmare. China's ecosystem reduces friction. And in manufacturing, friction is money. China also built a deep bench of engineers and skilled workers. If you need to ramp up production and hire 10,000 people fast, China can often do it in weeks. In most places, you can't. This ecosystem took decades to build, layer by layer, and it's almost impossible to replicate quickly. That is China's quiet advantage, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a headline about cheap labor. Economists have a name for what China created: state capitalism. It's not pure socialism because private companies exist and markets operate. It's not pure capitalism because the state controls key sectors, directs investment, and can crush any company that grows too independent. The biggest companies are state-owned enterprises, SOEs, especially in banking, energy, telecommunications, and transportation. These firms often get cheap credit from state banks, preferential regulatory treatment, and protection from competition. But private companies exist too, and some became enormous. Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei. Tech giants that can stand toe-to-toe with American firms. And here, as the uncomfortable truth for the outside world, this hybrid model is extremely effective at rapid industrialization. When the government decides something must be built, it gets built. No endless debates. No lawsuits that freeze projects for years. No political cycles that reset priorities every election. That speed is a superpower in development, and it's also why this model terrifies democracies, because speed doesn't come free. It's purchased with control. High-speed rail is the perfect example. In 2008, China had almost no high-speed rail network compared to what exists today. Then suddenly, the lines started appearing like veins across a map. Today, China has more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined, over 25,000 miles, built in under 15 years. That is not normal. That is a state deciding to bend geography. But here's the billion-dollar question. Can this model work elsewhere? Some countries try to copy it. Special zones, industrial policy, state-led infrastructure. Others argue it only worked because China had unique conditions, a massive population, an authoritarian system capable of enforcing long-term plans, and a global moment when the West was hungry for low-cost manufacturing and willing to outsource enormous chunks of production. Now let's run through the numbers, because they still sound unreal even when you've heard them before. In 1978, China's GDP was about $150 billion. Today, it's over $17 trillion, more than 100 times bigger. In 1978, about 88% of Chinese people lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's under 1%. Life expectancy rose from roughly 66 years to around 78. Literacy rates surged from roughly two-thirds to well over 90%. In 1978, China had basically zero foreign investment. Today, it's one of the biggest recipients of foreign direct investment. And it also invests abroad on a massive scale through initiatives like the Belt and Road. It went from producing around 2% of global manufacturing to roughly 28%. Chinese tourism went from almost non-existent to hundreds of billions in annual spending abroad before COVID. China now graduates staggering numbers of STEM students each year, numbers that reshape the global competition for talent. This isn't a small development story. This is a civilizational transformation within a single generation. And that transformation changed everything outside China, too. Global supply chains now run through Chinese factories, Chinese ports, and Chinese industrial clusters. Your phone, your laptop, your clothes, half the objects in your house were made there, or contain parts made there, or rely on machines that were made there. And once you see how complete the system is, you understand why decoupling is so hard. It's not like unplugging a cable. It's like trying to rebuild an entire nervous system while the body is still moving. For the United States, China's rise wasn't just an economic story. It became a national security story. The same supply chains that made consumer goods cheaper also created dependence. That dependence is why you hear constant talk of trade wars, tariffs, export controls, chip bans, and reshoring. Washington isn't only worried about competition, it's worried about leverage. Because when one country sits at the center of the world's manufacturing web, it can pull threads. For Europe, the story is equally tense, but more complicated. European firms built deep ties to Chinese manufacturing and Chinese markets. German industry, for example, leaned heavily on China for both demand and supply chain efficiency. At the same time, European governments now face pressure to reduce strategic dependencies, especially in sectors like clean energy components, batteries, rare earth processing, and telecom infrastructure. Europe wants competitiveness, but it also wants resilience. And those two goals are now in direct conflict. And for developing countries, China's rise changed the ladder itself. For decades, the classic development path was simple: offer cheap labor, attract factories, climb into higher-value industries. China didn't just climb that ladder, it started manufacturing the ladder. That makes it harder for latecomers, because they're not just competing against low wages, they're competing against an ecosystem, a state strategy, and a supply chain gravity that's been engineered for 40 years. It also proved something that shook the global consensus. Maybe there is more than one path to development. The Western model preached that democracy and free markets were the route to prosperity. China essentially said, "Watch this," and achieved rapid growth with authoritarian governance and state-directed capital. Whether that's good or bad depends on who you ask, but it undeniably changed the conversation. And now, here's the breaking news edge of this story. The world is living inside the consequences. The West is trying to rebalance supply chains without detonating inflation. Companies are trying to diversify without losing efficiency. Governments are trying to manage risk without triggering a Cold War spiral. Meanwhile, China is trying to move up the value chain into chips, AI, advanced manufacturing, while facing rising external pressure and internal constraints. The era of easy globalization is over. The era of contested interdependence has begun. Thanks for watching Audio Insight. If you want more documentary breakdowns that connect economics, trade, and geopolitics into one clear story, stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe. Because the next decade will be written in supply chains, and we're going to follow every line.